On a cold December morning in 2020, a passerby walking near a rest stop in Lincoln County, Oregon, made a chilling discovery. Hidden just outside the rest area, amidst the dense forest, were human remains concealed inside a duffel bag. This grim find would set off a chain of events, uncovering a tragic story that had gone unnoticed for far too long. When the police arrived at the scene, they quickly determined that the remains belonged to a female child. The bag was carefully hidden in the forest, an eerie testament to the effort taken to conceal this young life. The investigators estimated that the girl had been deceased for between 30 and 60 days before her remains were discovered. She appeared to be between the ages of 7 and 9 years old. The news of the discovery shocked the local community and resonated far beyond the borders of Lincoln County. Who was this young girl? How did she end up alone and abandoned in the woods? These questions weighed heavily on the minds of the investigators and the public alike. The Oregon State Medical Examiner's Office took on the task of uncovering the identity of the little girl. Samples from her remains were carefully collected and sent for DNA testing. Parabon Nanolabs, known for their expertise in forensic DNA analysis, extracted the DNA from the samples. Nearly a year later, on October 4, 2021, they notified the Oregon State Police that they had made an identification. The girl in the duffel bag was 9-year-old Haley Mae Koblenz. Haley's story was as heartbreaking as it was complex. She was born in Colorado and had been living with her biological mother, Shauna Browning, and her mother's girlfriend, Lauren Harrison, in various locations across Oregon and the Pacific Northwest since 2015. Her life had been marked by instability and transience, moving from place to place without a stable home. Despite her young age, Haley's death had not been reported. This fact added a layer of mystery and sorrow to the investigation. How could a child go missing, be brutally disposed of, and yet no one seemed to notice or report her absence? It was a tragic reflection of a life lived on the margins, away from the safety nets and support systems that many take for granted. As investigators delved deeper into Haley's background, a troubling picture began to emerge. It was speculated that Shauna Browning had a younger son, who, like Haley, had different fathers and lived a similarly unstable life. Reports suggested that Shauna might have lived in and out of hotels for about 5 years and did not have custody of at least one of her children. The instability and possible neglect painted a bleak picture of Haley's short life. On November 30th, 2021, a significant breakthrough came when Shauna Browning, 29, and her girlfriend, Lauren Harrison, 34, were arrested in Detroit, Michigan. Both women were charged with aggravated murder in connection to Haley's death. They were swiftly taken into custody and held without bail, their arrests raising as many questions as they answered. I'm now a 31-year-old woman living in a small town in the United States. This is a story of strength, determination, and sheer bravery. Every day, I tell myself how lucky I am because of the story you're about to hear. It was the year 1998, about 20 years ago, a crisp, dry spring morning, a Saturday, to be exact. I lived in a suburban neighborhood. It was a place where doors were often left slightly ajar because we felt safe. My best friend, who I'll call Erica, lived next door. We spent most of our time together, and this day was no different. After breakfast, I ventured into Erica's house, and we decided to play outside. We were skipping with a rope and dancing around on the pavement when a tall red-haired woman appeared. We knew her as Caroline, a friend of Erica's mom. She was intimidating, dressed in black knee-high boots, red fishnet tights, a red leather skirt, a black top, and a jacket. She wore too much makeup, her hair was loud and frizzy, and she had a habit of making a deep, short cough noise every few minutes, as if she had a cold. I remember she had a cigarette in her mouth. Caroline was a big presence, and both Erica and I knew her well. We greeted her excitedly as she approached the front garden where we were playing. "Erica, where's your mom?" she asked. Erica replied, "In the house. Do you want me to go get her?" Caroline shook her head, saying, "Oh no, it's okay. I'm just wondering is all." She then asked if we could come with her to her place as she wanted a bit of quiet time. "Oh, okay. I guess," we said, dropping our skipping rope and heading on our way. A few yards along the road, Caroline put her hands out for us to hold, and we did. We were two innocent children, smiling and happy, walking with a woman we trusted. Little did we know what was about to happen. As we walked to the end of the street, I started to panic. My dad had always told me not to leave our street, or I would be punished and grounded. But then I remembered that Caroline was a friend of Erica's mom, so we wouldn't get into trouble. Caroline lit a cigarette as we continued to walk. It felt like we were walking for an eternity. Erica and I were skipping, holding her hands, carefree and unaware. I saw a small park and asked, "Are we allowed to play in the park?" Caroline shouted, "No." Her loud outburst and the shudder of her hand scared me a little, but I knew that no meant no, so I didn't ask again. Erica just looked at me with a small, confused smile. What felt like an hour later, we arrived at Caroline's property, a small block of flats. It was a ground floor flat, front door to the right. I was kind of excited because I never really got to go to places unless it was my grandma's or my auntie's house. We got inside, and Caroline immediately bolted the door and crossed the chain. I didn't think too much of it, assuming she was just trying to look after us. We went into the flat, which was open plan, with a kitchen to the right and a large living room to the left. It was very spacious. I vividly remember her vertical pink blinds in the windows, all closed. Erica and I were just wondering what to do. Caroline didn't turn the TV on and began to act a bit strange. She was pacing across the living room, not too fast but enough to make me notice. Erica and I were clapping our hands, singing songs, and giggling. The usual stuff little girls do. Being a bit older, I felt a small responsibility for Erica, but I wasn't too educated myself. Caroline was peeping out her blinds, looking around constantly. I picked up on this behavior quickly but didn't ask what she was doing. In hindsight, I know she was waiting for someone, looking for their arrival. Caroline paced again, and I started to get worried. I asked if we could watch TV, and she shouted, "No." I got quite upset. I didn't understand why we weren't allowed to watch TV or why she would shout at us. I mean, she said she was looking after us, so why not? I was a moody child and got upset easily. Erica was still none the wiser. A few minutes later, Caroline went back to the front window, poking her head out. I asked her, "Are you looking for someone?" She replied, "Yes, I am. They're late." This justified her behavior in my mind. Her pacing continued for a few minutes. I then asked if I could go home because I was hungry and tired. Caroline shouted, "You're not going home." I replied, "What? Yes, I am. You said you were just minding us." She told me to be quiet and sit down. She then lit another cigarette, clearly angry, which I didn't like. I started to panic, and Erica looked deflated and upset. By this time, it must have been at least 2 hours, although it felt like weeks. I went to approach the front door, but Caroline halted over toward me. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "We want to go home now," I replied. "You're not going anywhere. You're staying here with me," she said firmly. I began to cry. I was really upset and frightened. I got Erica, and we sat on the sofa, but I was still petrified. I wanted my mom. I didn't know what to do. Caroline was still looking through the window, as if expecting someone to appear. I was too upset to do anything. So, with all my might, I stood up, barged over to her kitchen, and pulled open a drawer. Caroline was still looking through the window. I grabbed a knife. It was a simple butter knife, but I was trembling with fear. I grabbed Erica and approached the front door. Caroline made her way over. "What are you doing?" she yelled. "We're leaving." "You let us go now," I demanded. She replied, "Don't be so ridiculous," and tried to snatch the knife. I told her, "If you don't let us go, I will attack you." She laughed. With that, I charged toward her, and she screamed. Erica was sobbing and screaming, and I yelled too, "Let us go. Somebody help." We were hoping that we would be heard. We continued to scream while the knife was facing Caroline. She panicked and told us to shut up and calm down. She then turned her back and walked toward the window. With that, I managed to stand on the tips of my toes, unlock the bolt, and grab Erica. We legged it as fast as we could. I didn't know the way home. I just guessed. It was the fastest I'd ever run in my life. Even to this day, I was sobbing, tears running down my face, my hands trembling with fear, and poor Erica was being strung along by my hand. I dashed the knife somewhere while running, and I remember seeing the park. I knew we were heading in the right direction. We continued to run as fast as we could and eventually found our street. By this point, we were out of breath. I made sure Erica got into her house and told her to lock the door. I then entered my home. My mom was still asleep. I didn't care. I was home. To this day, I genuinely believe both Erica and I were going to be sold to unknown predators or used for human trafficking or something worse. I'm just glad I found the strength to get away. I don't remember seeing Caroline again after that. I told my mom this story when she woke up, and of course, she didn't believe me. That still hurts me to this day, as I know it would have been a different story if I had gone forever. A few months after the incident, we moved to another area. Although it went to the back of my mind, I'll never forget that I was abducted. Never underestimate those closest to you when you have children. When I was around 8 years old, I took karate lessons at a small dojo in the local mini-mall. Thinking back on those days still sends shivers down my spine, as I realize now just how close I came to a terrible fate. My lessons were twice a week, each lasting an hour. My mom would drop me off and then disappear to run errands or do some shopping until it was time to pick me up again. Most of the other parents would sit in the lobby, watching their kids through the glass window that separated the waiting area from the dojo floor. But not my mom. She always seemed to have something more important to do. The lobby itself was a small, cramped space with uncomfortable plastic chairs lined up against the walls. A few potted plants struggled for life in the dim lighting, and the air always smelled faintly of sweat and cleaning solution. There was a bulletin board cluttered with flyers for local events and ads for martial arts gear. A large, framed poster of a karate master striking a fierce pose hung prominently on one wall, serving as both inspiration and decoration. One particular man often caught my eye. He was in the lobby almost every time I had a lesson. He looked to be in his 50s, with dark hair streaked with gray, a long beard, and a mustache that hid his mouth in a thick forest of whiskers. His clothes were always the same, worn jeans and a flannel shirt that looked like it had seen better days. As a kid, I assumed he was just another parent, there to watch his child's progress. But I never saw him drop anyone off or pick anyone up. He was just there, watching. I was too young to fully understand that something was off about this. My 8-year-old brain didn't register the weirdness of a man who seemed to hang out in the lobby of a karate center without any apparent reason. It wasn't until much later that I realized how wrong it was. One day, I reached a new milestone in my karate training and graduated to a green belt. Or was it yellow? The color doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. What mattered was that this promotion meant a change in my class schedule, something my mom hadn't realized. She dropped me off at the same time as usual, but when I got inside, I discovered I wasn't supposed to be there. My new class was at a different time, and I wasn't allowed to join the session that was currently in progress. Standing in the lobby, feeling a mix of disappointment and confusion, I decided to go look for my mom in the mini mall. I knew she was probably shopping somewhere close by. The mini mall wasn't huge, but it had a variety of stores: a JCPenney, a small grocery store, a toy shop, and a few others. I figured I could find her easily enough. As I walked through the mall, I noticed the man from the lobby following me. He wasn't trying to hide it either. He came right up behind me and tapped me on the shoulder. "Hey, your mom told me to find you," he said, his voice low and gruff. "Your sister's in the hospital. She sent me to get you." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. My sister in the hospital? My mind raced with fear and confusion. The man described my mom and my sister perfectly, down to the clothes they were wearing that day. It was enough to convince me he was telling the truth. I started to cry, worried about my sister, and followed him as he led me toward the exit. He said his van was parked just outside, a couple of stores down from the karate center. We walked together, him guiding me with a firm hand on my shoulder. My thoughts were a jumbled mess of concern for my sister and the urgent need to get to my parents. But something didn't sit right with me. Despite my fear and confusion, a small voice in the back of my mind kept telling me this was wrong. My mom never talked to this man. I'd never seen them interact. Why would she send him to get me? As we neared the van, I glanced back and saw my mom through the window of the JCPenney. Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly overshadowed by a new wave of fear. The man was still holding my shoulder, his grip tightening as he sensed my hesitation. "We have to hurry," he said, pulling me toward the van. But I dug my heels in and pointed toward my mom. "She's right there," I said, my voice shaking. For a moment, the man froze. Then he let go of me, his expression shifting from urgency to frustration. Without another word, he turned and hurried to his van, slamming the door and speeding off in a cloud of exhaust fumes. It wasn't until he was gone that I fully grasped what had just happened. I had almost been kidnapped. The reality of it hit me hard, and I ran into the JCPenney, tears streaming down my face. I found my mom and hugged her tightly, trying to explain what had happened between sobs. But instead of comforting me, she yelled at me for missing my karate lesson and even smacked me upside the head. She dragged me back to the dojo, where my sensei explained that my lesson times had changed because of my new belt. He had probably told her before, but she hadn't paid attention. I tried to tell her about the man who said he was her friend, but she brushed it off. "He must have thought you were someone else," she said dismissively. "Come on, let's go." The incident left a lasting scar. For years, the memory of that day festered inside me, a mix of fear and anger at my mother's indifference. As I grew older, I became more aware of the dangers that had lurked just out of sight during my childhood. The stranger danger warnings we received at school suddenly seemed all too real. Reflecting on my childhood, I realized that my mother had never been truly present in my life. She had very little interest in me, or in being a mom at all. I hadn't seen her since I was 13 or 14, and between my birth and her disappearance, her presence had been sporadic at best. The day at the mini mall was just one of many instances where her neglect and lack of responsibility put me in harm's way. Now, as an adult, I've worked hard to build a life of stability and love, far removed from the chaotic and neglectful environment of my childhood. Camping in the dense woods of Arkansas in the early 2000s was a welcome escape from the stress of daily life. I was about 20 years old, and the eerie ambience of the Blair Witch Project was still fresh in my mind. The film had instilled a lingering sense of dread whenever I ventured into the wilderness. Nevertheless, the call of the wild was irresistible, and I found myself setting up camp in a remote area of the Ozark National Forest. The day had been perfect, crystal clear skies, the scent of pine in the air, and the soothing sounds of birds chirping and a nearby stream bubbling. My friends and I had hiked for hours, exploring the trails and marveling at the untouched beauty of nature. By evening, we were tired but content, sitting around the campfire, sharing stories, and roasting marshmallows. The stars above twinkled brightly, uninhibited by city lights, creating a breathtaking canopy. As the fire died down and the embers glowed faintly, we decided to call it a night. We crawled into our tents, zipped up our sleeping bags, and quickly drifted off to sleep, lulled by the gentle sounds of the forest. It must have been around 2 or 3 in the morning when I was abruptly woken up by a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of a small child crying and running around our tent, desperately trying to get in. I lay there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The cries were frantic and high-pitched, filled with fear and desperation. My first thought was that I must be dreaming, but the sounds were too real, too immediate. I nudged my friend Jake, who was sleeping next to me. "Jake, wake up. Do you hear that?" Jake groggily opened his eyes, his expression quickly turning from confusion to alarm. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. "I don't know," I replied, my voice shaking. "It sounds like a kid." We both sat up, straining to listen. The crying continued, punctuated by the sound of small feet pattering around the tent. I felt a surge of panic. What was a child doing out here in the middle of the night? And why was it alone? Jake and I exchanged worried glances. "We need to see what's going on," he said, reaching for the flashlight. I grabbed my jacket, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the zipper. We unzipped the tent door cautiously, the cries now louder and more urgent. As we stepped outside, the beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the surrounding trees and casting long, eerie shadows. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the cold air bit at my skin. There, standing just a few feet from our tent, was a little boy who couldn't have been more than 3 years old. He was wearing nothing but a diaper, his face streaked with tears, and his tiny body shivering from the cold. I felt a wave of disbelief wash over me. How could this be happening? My mind raced with questions and scenarios, each more troubling than the last. I knelt down, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Hey there, buddy," I said softly. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The boy looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, his crying subsiding into pitiful whimpers. He didn't respond, just stood there shivering. I took off my jacket and gently wrapped it around him, trying to offer some comfort and warmth. "What do we do?" Jake asked, his voice low and urgent. I shook my head, feeling utterly helpless. "I don't know. We can't just leave him here, but we can't go around knocking on tents in the middle of the night either." The ranger station was closed at this hour, and we had no way of knowing where this child had come from. I pulled out my cell phone, but there was no signal this deep in the forest. "We should call the cops," I said. "It's the safest thing to do." Just as I was about to suggest we head to a spot with better reception, we heard a voice calling out from the trail. "How did you get out?" The voice was calm, almost casual, and it sent a shiver down my spine. We turned to see a woman walking towards us. She looked to be in her late 20s, dressed in a worn-out sweatshirt and jeans, her hair disheveled. The little boy's face lit up as soon as he saw her, and he started crying out, "Mama! Mama!" He ran towards her, his tiny legs stumbling over the uneven ground. The woman picked him up, holding him close, and sighed. "Thank you," she said nonchalantly, as if finding her half-naked child wandering around a campsite in the middle of the night was an everyday occurrence. She turned and started walking away, the boy clinging to her. I stood there, stunned and speechless. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Relief that the boy was safe, confusion at the woman's calm demeanor, and anger that she had let this happen in the first place. As a parent, I couldn't fathom how she could be so nonchalant about the whole situation. "Wait," I called after her. "Are you sure everything's okay?" She turned back briefly, giving me a tired smile. "Yeah, he's fine. Just wandered off. Thanks again." And with that, she disappeared into the darkness, leaving me standing there with 100 unanswered questions. Jake and I went back to the tent, but sleep was out of the question. We lay there in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The events of the night played over and over in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why had she been so calm? Why was the child out in the middle of the night wearing only a diaper? And how had he managed to wander so far without her noticing? The next morning, we packed up our camp, the mood somber and reflective. As we drove back to town, the questions continued to gnaw at me. We debated whether to report the incident to the rangers or the local authorities, but without any clear details or evidence, we doubted anything would come of it. In the end, we decided to let it go, hoping that the boy was truly safe and that it was just an unfortunate mistake. When I was a kid, all I ever wanted was to be a Boy Scout. To me, scouting wasn't just about learning how to tie knots or start a fire. It was about camaraderie, adventure, and becoming part of something larger than myself. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, I was surrounded by stories of the great outdoors. My dad used to tell me about his camping trips and the adventures he had as a young scout. Those tales fired up my imagination and made me yearn for my own experiences. I was 10 years old when I finally mustered the courage to ask my mom if I could join the local Boy Scout troop. She was hesitant at first, and I could see why. My mom had grown up in Russia, where organizations similar to the Scouts were often used for military training. Her childhood memories were filled with rigid discipline and a sense of duty rather than the fun and adventure I was yearning for. Convincing her took some time, and I remember the countless discussions we had about it. One evening, I asked our troop leader, Mrs. Thompson, to speak with my mom. Mrs. Thompson was a kind-hearted woman, probably in her early 40s, with a warm smile and a knack for making everyone feel at ease. She patiently answered all of my mom's questions, addressing every concern with the same calm demeanor. She explained that scouting in America was all about building character, learning essential life skills, and fostering a sense of community. After that conversation, my mom's worries seemed to melt away, and she finally gave me her blessing to join the Scouts. I was ecstatic. The very next week, I proudly donned my new Scout uniform and walked into my first meeting. The room was filled with boys around my age, all buzzing with excitement. We started the meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by the Scout Oath. It felt like I was finally part of something meaningful. However, my excitement quickly faded when I realized that our troop meetings were often disorganized and lacked the structure I had imagined. Mrs. Thompson, despite her best efforts, seemed overwhelmed. She was a single mother with 3 kids of her own, and I could tell she was struggling to keep everything together. Our activities often fell short of the grand adventures I had envisioned. Instead of camping trips and outdoor skills, we spent most of our meetings indoors, doing crafts or playing simple games. 6 months into my scouting journey, a glimmer of hope appeared. We received an invitation from Mr. Anderson, a scout leader from a neighboring county, to join his troop on a camping trip. This was it, the adventure I had been waiting for. I couldn't contain my excitement. I had always loved camping with my family, but those trips had stopped after my parents separated. This trip felt like a chance to reclaim a piece of my childhood that I had lost. We left early on a crisp Saturday morning. Mr. Anderson picked us up in his beat-up old van, which smelled faintly of campfire and pine needles. The drive to the campsite was filled with laughter and chatter as we shared our hopes and expectations for the trip. There were 9 of us in total, including Mr. Anderson. He was a tall, burly man with a graying beard and a hearty laugh that could put anyone at ease. He had a way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the world when he talked to you. When we arrived at the campsite, Mr. Anderson gathered us together and gave us a brief lesson on how to set up our tents. Each tent was meant to hold 2 boys, but because we had an odd number, I ended up with a tent to myself. I didn't mind. In fact, I was thrilled. It felt like a special privilege, and I relished the thought of having my own little space in the wilderness. Setting up the tents was an adventure in itself. Some of the boys struggled with the poles and pegs, but Mr. Anderson patiently guided them through the process. I managed to set up my tent without too much trouble, feeling a sense of pride as I drove the final stake into the ground. The rest of the morning was spent learning first aid and general safety. Mr. Anderson paired me with him, and I became his visual aid for the demonstrations. For the next few hours, I was wrapped in bandages, carried on makeshift stretchers, and generally poked and prodded as he showed the other boys how to handle various emergencies. It was fun and surprisingly informative. I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment knowing that these skills might come in handy one day. After the first aid lessons, we took a break for lunch. Mr. Anderson had packed a hearty meal of sandwiches, fruit, and homemade cookies. We ate around a campfire, sharing stories and getting to know each other better. There was something magical about sitting in a circle, the crackling fire warming our faces, as we listened to Mr. Anderson's tales of past camping trips and adventures. He had a way of making even the simplest stories come alive, and I hung on his every word. Following our lunch break, we were given some free time to explore the area. The campsite was nestled in a dense forest, with a clear, babbling brook running through it. I wandered along the edge of the water, skipping stones and marveling at the beauty of the natural world. It was a peaceful, almost meditative experience, and I felt a deep sense of contentment. In the afternoon, Mr. Anderson gathered us together again for archery lessons. I was beyond excited. Ever since I had seen my first ninja movie, I had fantasized about shooting a bow and arrow. This was my chance to live out those dreams. Mr. Anderson gave us a thorough safety briefing, but I was so eager to start that I barely paid attention. When it was my turn to shoot, I could hardly contain my excitement. I stepped up to the line, drew back the string, and squatted down like a ninja. Mr. Anderson immediately corrected me, insisting that I stand upright. It took a bit of the thrill out of the moment, but as I released the arrow and watched it fly straight to the target, I felt a surge of exhilaration. The arrow hit exactly where I had aimed, and I couldn't help but grin from ear to ear. One by one, the other boys took their turns, and soon we were all shooting on our own. There was a lot of friendly competition, each of us trying to outdo the others. The atmosphere was filled with laughter and the occasional whoop of triumph as someone hit the bullseye. And then it happened. Kevin, one of the boys, was talking to another boy named Chris while he had an arrow knocked and the string pulled back about a quarter of the way. Chris said something that made Kevin turn toward him, and in that split second, Kevin lost his grip on the string. The arrow flew straight into Chris's chest, penetrating about 8 inches. Panic erupted. Mr. Anderson shouted for the first aid supplies, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. Chris was already struggling to breathe, his face pale with shock. Mr. Anderson did his best to stabilize him, packing the area around the wound and trying to keep Chris calm. He instructed 2 of the boys to run to the ranger station for help, and the rest of us stood around, paralyzed by fear and helplessness. Kevin was beside himself, pacing back and forth and muttering apologies. Mr. Anderson finally snapped at him to be quiet, and Kevin sank to the ground, tears streaming down his face. The wait for the ambulance felt like an eternity, each second stretching out painfully as we prayed for help to arrive. When the ambulance finally pulled up, the paramedics took over, and we all watched in stunned silence as they loaded Chris onto a stretcher and rushed him to the hospital. The trip was over. We packed up our gear as quickly as possible, the weight of what had happened hanging heavy over us. The ride home was somber. Kevin's wailing was the only sound that broke the silence. I could see the guilt etched into his face, and I knew he would carry the burden of that day for a long time. When we finally pulled into the parking lot where our parents were waiting, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The news about Chris's condition reached us the next morning. He had undergone surgery, and thankfully, it had gone well. The arrow had punctured his left lung, narrowly missing his heart. He was expected to make a full recovery. Kevin was probably the happiest to hear the news. Despite the accident, no charges were brought against him. Everyone involved agreed that it was a tragic accident, and a few months later, Kevin and Chris had a meeting where Kevin formally apologized. Chris accepted the apology, and as far as I know, he never held a grudge. My mom, however, was less forgiving. The second she heard about the incident, my scouting days were over. She didn't want to risk anything happening to me, and while I understood her fears, I couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment. Scouting had been my dream, and it was hard to let go of that. But life has a way of opening new doors when others close. With scouting no longer an option, I threw myself into BMX biking. I spent hours at the local skate park, learning tricks and pushing myself to new limits. It turned out to be a safer experience, and it gave me a new sense of purpose and excitement. I must have been around 8 years old when this happened, and my sister was 12 or 13. We lived in a tiny house we affectionately called the shack after our mom moved us there following her split from our father. It was all we could afford at the time, but it had a certain charm that made it feel like home, despite its cramped quarters. My sister and I shared a tiny bedroom, but the real perk of the shack was the huge backyard with a large above-ground pool and a deck where we would spend countless hours playing. The backyard is our favorite place to be. It was surrounded by a tall privacy fence, and being the nosy little kid I was, I loved climbing on some of the wooden boards to peek over and check out the neighbors. There were 2 little boys who lived in the house kitty corner to ours, and they went to my school. Every day, I made it a habit to climb up my side of the fence and chat with them. I never climbed over, just high enough to peer over and talk. Their uncle, Randy, was often in their backyard doing housework. He was probably in his mid-20s to 30s and seemed like a nice guy. My sister and I would hang on the fence and chat with him most days. The conversations were always innocent, and he seemed friendly enough. But looking back, I can see some red flags that I missed as a child. One time, Randy accidentally threw a basketball over our fence. We offered to grab it for him, but he insisted he could get it himself and easily hopped over the fence. At the time, we thought nothing of it, but in hindsight, I wonder if he was testing how quickly and easily he could scale the fence. Our mom worked the night shift, which meant my sister and I were often home alone at night. One day, my sister mentioned this in passing to Randy. She told him that our mom worked nights, so it was just the two of us in the house. That was all he needed to hear. I woke up one night to the sound of my sister crying. We shared a bunk bed, me on the bottom, her on the top, and when I stood up, I saw her out of bed, leaning against the wall with the phone in her hand, tears streaming down her face. I asked her what was wrong, but she assured me everything was fine and told me to go back to sleep. Trusting her, I did as she said. It wasn't until the next day that I learned what had happened. In the middle of the night, while our mom was at work, Randy had jumped the fence and tried to break in. He started banging on our bedroom window, demanding that my sister let him in. When she refused, he began walking around the entire house, banging on windows, yelling for her to let him in, and trying all the doors. Panicked, she got out of bed and called 911. That was when I woke up. By the time the police arrived, Randy had already jumped back over the fence and was safely in his own yard. When the cops knocked on his door, he denied everything, and without any concrete evidence, there was nothing they could do. We were shaken by the incident. Our mom couldn't change her work schedule, so she arranged for us to stay at our dad's house at night. A few years passed without incident, and we assumed everything was fine. I had long stopped talking to the boys next door and kept my distance from Randy. My sister and I felt a sense of normalcy returning to our lives. That was until it happened again. My sister was a couple of years older now and had a group of her friends over for a sleepover. We had a sliding glass door that led to the backyard, near where they were all sitting. The door had typical vertical blinds, but a few weeks earlier, one of them had broken, creating a gap where we couldn't get it to stay back on. The girls were all sitting around the couch playing board games when one of my sister's friends suddenly turned rigid. "Don't freak out," she said, "but there's a guy standing at your sliding glass door." Everyone turned around, and there was Randy again. His face pressed up against the glass where the gap in the blinds was. He was just watching them. Naturally, everyone freaked out, and my sister called 911. Just like last time, he jumped the fence before the cops arrived. When they questioned him, he denied everything, even though he was wearing the same outfit they described. We moved out of the shack and got a restraining order against Randy. He didn't show up to court, so the judge automatically granted the order. We never saw him again. Years later, I looked him up online and found out he was in prison for a bunch of random charges. Reflecting on these events as an adult, I can see how my childhood innocence shielded me from the true danger we were in. At the time, the shack was a place of adventure and discovery, not fear and paranoia. The backyard, with its pool and deck, was my playground, where I could lose myself in the joys of childhood. It was a place where my sister and I could bond, sharing secrets and dreams under the open sky.